The lights inside the five-star restaurant shimmered like liquid gold. Crystal chandeliers swung gently with the rhythm of conversations, laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. To the world outside, this was just another night in the city of towering ambitions. But for Daniel Hayes, a single father and former Marine, it was the first time in years he had worn a pressed shirt that wasn't wrinkled from pulling laundry out of an old dryer at midnight. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this place. Not among these people. The velvet chairs, the heavy aroma of expensive wine, and the whispers of million-dollar deals. It all felt like a parallel universe. Yet fate had a strange way of dragging him into rooms where he never belonged. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Arthur Kane, the CEO whose face often appeared on magazine covers. Billionaire, visionary, ruthless. To Daniel, he was more than that. He was the man who had quietly decided the fate of thousands of workers in the defense industry, including Daniel himself. Years ago, Arthur's company shut down a manufacturing unit, leaving Daniel and dozens of veterans without work. For most, it was just another headline. For Daniel, it meant empty cupboards, sleepless nights, and the day his little daughter asked him why they couldn't afford her school uniform. Tonight, Arthur Kane wasn't alone. He was surrounded. Not by board members or security staff, but by 12 ex-Marines, men Daniel recognized instantly. They weren't friends, not exactly, but comrades from a lifetime ago. Faces weathered by war, eyes that carried deserts and jungles within them, scars visible and invisible. They had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the dirtiest corners of the world. Yet tonight, they looked like wolves circling their prey. The tension was invisible to everyone else in the restaurant. Waiters passed by, pouring wine and serving steak, unaware that the air around this table was heavy with memories, debts, and something darker. Daniel adjusted his sleeve, his hand trembling slightly. Beneath the cuff, ink stretched across his forearm, a tattoo he had carried since deployment. It wasn't a piece of art for beauty. It was a mark of blood, loyalty, and sacrifice. The kind of ink that only those who had lived through fire could understand. He wasn't here to confront Kane. He wasn't even sure why he had accepted the invitation from an old squad mate, who insisted it was time. But when Kane's laugh filled the room, cold and arrogant, Daniel felt his chest tighten. One by one, the ex-Marines leaned in. Their words weren't loud, but sharp enough to slice through the room's warmth. "You remember us, Kane?" one of them whispered. "You remember the contracts, the promises, the graves we dug with our own hands?" Another added. Arthur's face stiffened. For the first time all evening, his fork hovered in the air, untouched. He looked around the table, perhaps searching for his bodyguards. But the Marines closed ranks, and then it happened. Daniel rolled his sleeve up, slowly, deliberately. The tattoo came into the dim light. It was an eagle perched over a battered shield, beneath it the names of fallen brothers etched in ink. But what froze the table wasn't just the design. It was the name in bold letters at the bottom: Arthur Kane's brother, the man whose death had been dismissed as collateral. Damage in a mission funded and directed by Kane's very company. The CEO's face went pale. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died around them, and in that silence, 12 ex-Marines stared at the man who had profited from their scars. While Daniel's tattoo screamed louder than any weapon, Daniel's past and the silent burden. The tattoo on Daniel's arm wasn't just ink. It was a story carved in pain and loyalty, one he carried every day since Afghanistan. But beneath the hard lines of that eagle and shield lived another reality, one that began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet mornings of his small apartment where the alarm clock was replaced by his daughter's laughter. Her name was Lily, 8 years old, with hair the color of morning sunlight and eyes that seemed older than her age. She had been born while Daniel was still serving, and for years she knew her father through shaky video calls, folded letters, and the occasional stuffed animal he mailed from overseas. When her mother passed away suddenly, an accident that shattered their fragile world, Daniel had come home for good. He never planned on being a single dad. But war had already taught him one thing. When the universe takes, you don't beg. It just means you have to give twice as much to what's left. So Daniel gave everything to Lily. Life wasn't easy. The paychecks after the layoff barely covered rent, and sometimes dinner was nothing more than boxed mac and cheese. Daniel worked odd jobs, warehouse shifts, driving trucks, repairing fences, anything to keep the lights on. Some nights he fell asleep still in his work boots, only to be woken by Lily draping a blanket over him. Yet for all the hardship, Lily never complained. She became his anchor, reminding him that he was more than just a soldier without a war, more than just a veteran forgotten by the system. In her small hands, he found reasons to keep standing. The reunion with his old Marine brothers hadn't been planned. It happened at a graveside. It was spring when Daniel received the message. One of their own, Corporal Travis O'Neill, had taken his own life. Another name, another reminder that the war followed them home long after the guns had gone quiet. Daniel had driven for hours just to stand at the funeral, his daughter's hand clasped tightly in his. There, among the rows of tombstones, he saw the familiar faces. Men aged by silence, carrying invisible rucksacks of guilt and loss. They embraced without words, the kind of embrace only Marines understood. It was there that the whispers began, about Kane, about the decisions that had cost lives, about a truth buried beneath corporate contracts and classified files. Each man had a story, a scar, a memory tied to Kane's empire. And when one of them said, "We need to make him listen," the rest didn't argue. Daniel hadn't agreed at first. His life was Lily and nothing more. But as he looked down at Travis's grave, and then at the tattoo inked with names that Kane's greed had turned into headstones, he knew he couldn't walk away. So when the invitation came for that dinner, sent through whispers and coded messages, Daniel said yes. Not for revenge, not for justice, but for something else he couldn't yet name. And now here he was, sitting across from Kane, surrounded by brothers who had bled in the same dirt. Kane's eyes had already flickered toward the tattoo, recognition dawning in his gaze. His fork rested on the table. His voice, once commanding, now wavered. Where did you get that ink?" he asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The other Marines leaned in closer, their presence suffocating, their silence louder than thunder. This wasn't just dinner anymore. This was judgment. The room freezes. The chandelier above the table swayed gently, though no wind touched it. Kane's eyes were locked on the tattoo, his hand trembling against the stem of his untouched wine glass. Around him, the 12 ex-Marines leaned closer, not men enjoying a reunion, but soldiers circling a target. Daniel kept his sleeve rolled, the ink burning in the silence. The name at the bottom, Michael Kane, hung like a ghost between them. Arthur Kane swallowed hard. "That name," his voice cracked. "You served with him?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't speak, but the scar near his temple, the worn leather of his hands, the quiet rage in his eyes, all were answers. One of the Marines, Sergeant Alvarez, leaned forward, his tone sharp as steel. "We didn't just serve with him. He was our brother. Your brother. And when he bled out in that valley, where the sand turned black with fire, it wasn't just the enemy we blamed. It was the contracts, the supply cuts, the decisions made in some boardroom far from the battlefield." "Your boardroom," Kane flinched. "You think I wanted that? You think I—" Another voice cut in. Marcus Hill, broad-shouldered and unblinking, slammed his fist softly against the table, rattling silverware. "Want? You profited. While we carried his body on our backs, you signed another deal. While his dog tags were buried, you cashed another check. Don't tell us what you wanted." The restaurant's laughter and chatter faded into background noise, a distant echo. At this table, time slowed. Waiters moved carefully around, eyes darting nervously toward the group, sensing a storm but not daring to step closer. Daniel finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Michael wasn't just another soldier. He was the one who saved me. The words drew every eye to him. Even the Marines, hardened as they were, leaned in. Daniel's chest rose with each heavy breath. That day in the valley, the ambush came fast. Bullets tore the air. I went down, hit in the leg. I would have died there. But Michael, he dragged me out. He took the round meant for me. I carried his name ever since because I owed him my life. And when I came home, when I looked at my daughter and still had a chance to raise her, it was because of him. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Kane's lips trembled. His polished mask cracked. For years, he had lived untouched in boardrooms, behind layers of wealth and distance. But now the ghosts he'd buried had come to sit at his table. Why? Kane whispered, his voice barely audible. Why didn't anyone tell me this? Daniel's eyes darkened. Because you never asked. The words landed heavier than any weapon. Around the table, the Marines nodded slowly. Their silence wasn't just agreement, it was accusation. For the first time, Arthur Kane looked small. Smaller than the men who had once followed his brother into fire. Smaller than the memory inked into Daniel's skin. But the night wasn't over. The tattoo had only opened the wound. What came next would decide whether this dinner ended in truth or in destruction. The betrayal in the valley. The table felt colder than steel. Kane's eyes darted from one Marine to another, like a man surrounded not by people but by shadows of the past he had tried to bury. Daniel kept his sleeve rolled up, his tattoo exposed like an open wound. Every line of ink seemed alive under the golden light of the chandelier, dragging the CEO deeper into a memory he had avoided for years. Sergeant Alvarez finally broke the silence, his voice low but edged with fury. You think this is just about a name on skin? You don't even know the truth about your own brother's death, Kane. Do you? Arthur's face twitched. I was told it was combat, ambush, nothing more. That's what the report said. The Marines exchanged looks, half anger, half pity. Marcus leaned in, his jaw tight. Reports. Paper lies. The truth never made it past the desert. Daniel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The day Michael died, we were supposed to have air support, supposed to have supplies, but they never came. Do you know why? Arthur shook his head slowly, his polished confidence slipping further with every word. Because, Daniel said, leaning forward, your company rerouted the funding. The fuel meant for our birds? Sold off. The vehicles we needed? Delayed, on purpose, so the contract could stretch longer. And when we called for backup, no one answered. We were left there, bleeding in the sand. Your brother wasn't killed by the enemy alone. He was killed by a pen stroke in your office. The words hit like artillery. Arthur's hand trembled against the tablecloth. His lips parted, but no words came. The truth, delivered by the men who had lived it, was heavier than any denial he could muster. Sergeant Alvarez's fists clenched. We carried Michael out. We watched him choke on blood while the radios stayed dead. And then, months later, we saw your face smiling on television about profits and growth. You spoke about efficiency. Do you know what efficiency looked like to us? A coffin draped in a flag, the CEO's breath hitched. He looked down at his untouched plate, the steak cooling as if even the food refused to be part of this night. Daniel's voice softened, but the edge remained. I never told Lily the details. She knows Michael was my brother in arms. She knows I carry his name because he gave me a chance to be her father. But she doesn't know that it was greed, your greed, that left him there. For a long moment, Arthur Kane said nothing. His chest rose and fell quickly, like a man drowning in a sea of ghosts. The mask of power he wore in every boardroom cracked beyond repair. Finally, he whispered, I didn't know. Alvarez spat the words back at him. You didn't want to know. The 12 Marines sat back slightly, but their presence still pressed against him like a wall. Kane wasn't just facing them. He was facing the judgment of every soldier whose name had turned into ink on someone's arm, or stone in the ground. And in that heavy silence, Daniel realized something. This dinner wasn't just about Kane, it was about them too. About carrying pain too long. About speaking truths that had been choking their throats for years. But the night wasn't finished. Kane had heard the truth. Now he would have to face the choice. What to do with it? The ultimatum. The restaurant had grown unnaturally quiet. Conversations at the nearby tables became hushed. as if the weight at the Marine's table spread like a shadow across the entire room. No music played, no laughter carried. Only the low hum of the chandelier filled the silence. Arthur Kane sat hunched, his manicured hands trembling. The truth of his brother's death had finally been carved into him, not by official reports or polished press statements, but by the very men who had carried Michael's body through fire. Sergeant Alvarez leaned forward, his eyes burning. You've lived your life behind money and walls, but walls don't keep out ghosts. Tonight, they're here, sitting across from you, and you've got one chance, one, to do something before they bury you alive. Kane's voice cracked, desperate. What do you want from me? Money? Apologies? None of that will change what happened. Marcus shook his head slowly, his massive frame looming over the table. We don't want money. We want truth. We want acknowledgement. You built an empire out of blood, and you pretended it wasn't yours. That ends tonight. The CEO's gaze darted between them, panic rising. But Daniel's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. We don't want your wealth, Kane. We want your word. Your brother's name deserves more than silence. Our brothers deserve more than to be filed away in some forgotten drawer. You will stand up in front of the world and admit the cost of your empire. Or, Daniel's pause was long, deliberate. He let the word hang in the air, heavier than lead. You'll find out what it means when 12 Marines decide you've run out of excuses. Arthur swallowed hard, beads of sweat gathering at his temple. He had faced hostile boards, vicious competitors, even political scrutiny. But nothing compared to the 12 pairs of eyes staring at him now. Eyes that had seen death and carried it home. For the first time in years, he was the weakest man in the room, yet Daniel's chest felt tight. He had spoken the words with conviction, but inside, he wrestled with something darker: revenge, justice, survival. He thought of Michael, his laugh in the barracks, the way he cracked jokes during long marches, the moment he had thrown himself into gunfire to save a brother. Michael deserved justice. He deserved truth. But then Daniel thought of Lily, her small hands in his, the nights she fell asleep on his shoulder while he sat exhausted from work. What kind of man would she see him as if tonight ended in blood? Would she still look at him with trust or with fear? His daughter had given him purpose beyond war. She was the reason he had survived Michael's sacrifice, and he couldn't let vengeance turn him into something Michael himself would have despised. Daniel's eyes lowered to his tattoo. The ink wasn't just pain. It was memory, loyalty, a reminder of what it meant to live for someone else. So when Alvarez's fist clenched and Marcus muttered, "He doesn't deserve another chance," Daniel raised a hand. "Wait." The word was quiet, but it froze the table. Every Marine turned to him, surprise in their hardened faces. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Kane. You don't get to walk away clean, but you will get a chance. You will speak the truth. You will honor your brother's name. And if you don't, his voice deepened, unshakable, then it won't be me you'll face. It'll be all of us. The Marines studied him, their loyalty to Daniel outweighing their thirst for vengeance. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded. Arthur Kane stared back at Daniel, broken. If I do this, if I speak out, it will destroy me. Daniel's reply was soft, almost sorrowful. Then maybe destruction is what you've earned, but at least it'll be honest. For the first time that night, the CEO lowered his head, not in defeat, but in something closer to grief. The weight of a brother lost, a truth ignored, and a dozen soldiers who refused to let him forget. The ultimatum had been set, and the night was far from over. Breaking point, Arthur Kane's shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, the kind he had never carried before. Boardrooms, stockholders, quarterly reports. None of those battles had prepared him for 12 pairs of eyes that had looked into hell and returned. His lips parted, but no words came. His hand, once steady with a pen that signed away fortunes, now trembled as he clutched the edge of the table. "Sergeant," Alvarez's voice cut through the silence. "You don't deserve to speak until you're ready to admit the truth." The CEO flinched as though struck. He looked at Alvarez, then at Marcus, then at Daniel, lingering on him the longest. Daniel's sleeve was still rolled, his tattoo exposed, his face unreadable. Kane's gaze locked on the ink, and for a moment, his carefully constructed empire crumbled in his mind. All he saw was his brother's face, Michael's laugh, Michael's stubbornness, Michael's death. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I never wanted this. I never wanted him gone. I thought I was protecting him by building power, by making sure he'd never be forgotten. And yet all I did was... His words faltered. Shame filled the spaces silence left behind. Marcus slammed his palm against the table, rattling glasses. Spare us your excuses. We buried him, not you. We carried his weight, not you. You hid behind walls while your brother bled for us. Don't you dare act like you cared. Kane's jaw clenched, and for the first time tears welled in his eyes. You think I didn't care? He was my brother. I live every day with that hole in my chest. I see his face every night. The Marines didn't soften. They sat like stone, unforgiving. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy with restrained fire. If you see his face every night, then why did it take 12 Marines surrounding you at dinner to admit it? Where was this grief when you stood in front of cameras smiling? Where was it when your greed starved us of support? Michael's not just your brother. He was ours too, and he saved me. So don't sit here and act like your grief is heavier than ours. The CEO broke then. His face fell into his hands, his shoulders shaking. The sound of a powerful man crying filled the golden room, raw and unhidden. Patrons in the background pretended not to watch, but every eye had turned toward the table. For the first time, Arthur Kane wasn't untouchable. He was just a broken man, drowning in regret. Daniel's chest tightened. His brothers wanted justice, and they deserved it. But as Kane wept, Daniel felt something unexpected. Pity. He thought of Lily. He pictured her wide eyes looking up at him, asking if monsters were real. He remembered answering softly, yes, but sometimes they don't know they're monsters until someone tells them. What would Lily see if she saw her father tonight? A Marine demanding blood? Or a man who chose a different path? Michael's sacrifice echoed in his mind. His last words in the dust and fire. Take care of them, Danny. Take care of what matters. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. His brother's anger surged like fire beside him, but inside him, another battle raged. He could end Kane's career, his life, his legacy, right here, right now. Or he could choose something harder, to let him live, but branded forever by truth. He opened his eyes, meeting Kane's tear-filled gaze. You don't get forgiveness tonight, Daniel said softly. Not from us, but you do get a choice. Stand up tomorrow and tell the world the truth. Admit what you did, admit who you failed, admit who saved me while you turned away. That's how you honor Michael. That's how you begin to pay the debt you owe. Kane stared at him, broken, shaking, and nodded slowly. The Marines looked at Daniel, some with agreement, some with frustration, but none spoke. They had seen him lead before, and tonight they followed again. Daniel rolled down his sleeve, covering the tattoo. But its meaning was carved deeper than skin. Tonight, he hadn't just shown Kane the ink, he had reminded himself of what it meant. And as silence settled over the table once more, Daniel knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of Kane's reckoning. The reckoning. The next morning, the city awoke to headlines it never expected. A press conference had been called by Arthur Kane himself. The man who never admitted weakness, who never apologized for anything, who had built an empire on contracts and power, now stood in front of cameras with hollow eyes. The Marines didn't appear beside him. They didn't need to. Their presence was felt in every word he was about to speak. Daniel, watching from the back of the crowded room with Alvarez and Marcus at his side, kept his arms folded. His sleeve was rolled down, the tattoo hidden now, but its weight pulsed beneath his skin. Kane's voice trembled at first. The microphones caught every falter, every hesitation. I have lived my life believing success was measured in numbers, in profits, in growth. But I stand before you today ashamed, because that success was built on sacrifices I ignored, on lives I refused to see. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching. Cameras flashed. Kane continued, his tone raw, stripped of polish. My brother, Michael Caine, was one of those lives. He died in service, and for years I allowed myself to believe it was simply war's cruelty. But last night, I was confronted with the truth, that his death and the deaths of many were not just the enemy's doing. They were the cost of decisions I made and the greed I allowed. I cannot undo what has been done, but I will not hide it anymore. The room erupted with questions, flashes of light stinging his eyes. Caine raised a hand. I will be dismantling contracts that profit from neglect. I will establish a foundation in my brother's name, for veterans and their families, for men and women who carried burdens while I cashed checks. And I will spend the rest of my days making sure their voices are heard, even if mine breaks in the process. His words cracked at the end, his shoulders heavy, but he didn't run. For the first time, Arthur Caine stayed standing in the fire. Daniel felt something shift inside him. He didn't forgive Caine, not yet, maybe not ever. But watching him confess, watching the mask fall, Daniel realized Michael's name had finally been spoken in truth. Sergeant Alvarez muttered, "Words are just words. Let's see if he walks them." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe, but tonight Michael's ghost isn't silent anymore. That matters." The Marines left quietly, disappearing into the crowd. Their work here wasn't to bask in victory. It was simply to remind the world that the past doesn't stay buried forever. That night, Daniel returned home. The small apartment greeted him with the smell of pasta boiling on the stove. Lily was at the table coloring, her crayons scattered like tiny explosions of color across the page. "Daddy!" she called, running to him. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her small body grounding him in a way no battlefield ever could. He crouched, holding her tight, breathing in the scent of crayons and innocence. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally pulled back, Lily looked at him with curious eyes. "Did you fight today?" Daniel smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart. Today, I didn't fight. Today, I reminded someone of what really matters." She tilted her head. "Like what?" He glanced at his arm, the tattoo hidden beneath his sleeve. He thought of Michael, of the Marines, of Caine breaking down before the world. Then he looked back at Lily. "Family," he whispered. "Always family." Lily hugged him again, tighter this time, as if she understood more than her years should allow. And in that moment, Daniel realized that Michael's sacrifice had come full circle. His brother's name wasn't just ink on skin. It was alive in the little girl who held him now, and in the truth spoken aloud at last. For the first time in years, Daniel felt peace. Not because the battle was over, but because the fight for memory had finally been won. The last salute. The days that followed felt like the slow settling of dust after a long battle. Headlines still carried Arthur Caine's confession. Analysts debated whether it was redemption or strategy, but none of that mattered much to Daniel. What mattered was the silence that now filled his chest. Not heavy with grief, but calm, like a soldier finally lowering his weapon. One evening, he found himself standing at Michael's grave again. The cemetery was quiet, the sun sliding low across the horizon, painting the world in gold and shadows. He carried no flowers this time, only Lily's drawing folded neatly in his hand. Kneeling, he placed it against the stone. It was a child's picture of 3 figures holding hands, Lily, Daniel, and a man with broad shoulders. Above them, in shaky letters, she had written, "Uncle Michael." Daniel traced the name etched in granite. His voice was steady, almost a whisper. "They finally know your truth, brother, and I finally know mine. I can't raise you from the grave, but I can carry you forward. In her, in us." Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel. Marcus, Alvarez, and 2 other Marines stood at a distance, their heads bowed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was the purest kind of respect. Daniel straightened, his hand brushing over the tattoo on his arm. The ink no longer felt like a wound. It was a seal, a promise. Alvarez gave him a small nod, the kind only soldiers understood, the kind that said mission complete. For a moment, the world felt suspended. Then Daniel raised his hand, 2 fingers pressed to his brow, and gave one last salute to the stone before him. His arm lowered slowly, deliberately, as though setting down a weight he had carried too long. The Marines turned and left in silence, fading into the dusk like ghosts returning to their watch. Daniel stayed a little longer, listening to the wind move through the trees, carrying whispers that sounded almost like his brother's laugh. Then he smiled, small but real. When he finally walked back to his truck, Lily was waiting in the passenger seat, legs swinging. She looked at him with those curious eyes. "Daddy, are you okay now?" Daniel slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. He glanced at her, at the light of innocence and hope reflected in her gaze. "Yeah, baby," he said softly. "I think I finally am." As they drove away, the cemetery grew quiet again, but on the stone behind them, the folded picture fluttered in the wind. 3 figures, hand in hand, a family bound by memory, sacrifice, and love that no war could ever erase. And somewhere in the unseen, Michael Caine stood tall once more, watching over them with pride. Thanks for being here till the end. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe for more real moments, and share your thoughts. I read every comment.